Fantagraphics has been releasing the EC Artist Library over the last decade or so, and they've released 39 volumes to date. But 21 of those include mostly horror comics, and those are the ones I want to show off to you today. So stay tuned and watch this video until the end. And we're back. My name is Taylor. This is Taylor Talks Comics. Thank you for joining me. Please give the video a thumbs up. Comment down below with your favorite EC horror artist, or anything to do with EC Comics, or comics for that matter. I reply to all comments, and I love talking to you guys down there. And subscribe if you haven't already. This is part of my 31 days of horror comics all throughout the month of October. Every day I've been doing a new video on my channel about a different horror comic or horror comic related topic. And there's this handy dandy playlist in the playlist section of my channel for you to catch up on any of the videos that you've missed. So yes, today I want to talk about the EC Artist Library. I have a lot of videos on my channel showing off these books, showing off individual volumes, or showing off every volume so far. That's a video that I'll update later this year when we get the 39th volume officially in here, which will be the My Gun, This Jury, I think it's called, and it's collecting comedy and satire strips from the Panic comic book by Jack Davis and Wallace Wood. So now, if EC Comics, real quickly, if you don't know, if you're not familiar, was a run of comics all the way through the 1950s. It was a publisher that lasted before and after that, but the peak of their run was in the 1950s. And they dabbled in like 4 genres, basically. They did crime, horror, war comics, and science fiction. They eventually came out with Mad Magazine from Harvey Kurtzman. But the 4 genres is what these are focusing on. And today I'm just going to show you off the 21 volumes that collect mostly horror comics. There's a couple other volumes in the set that had 1 or 2 horror stories, but I don't want to, show those off. And the point of this video is to not only show off the great horror comics of the EC era, because they were so great at that. One of the things that they're most famous for. And I want to show off the greatness of the horror comics that they came out with, show you off all the different artists that were involved in the bullpen of those horror comics, and then also have some recommendations for you. I get a lot of questions about, where should I start with these? If I just want 1 or 2, I don't have enough room on my shelf for all 39, which one should I pick up? So I'm going to recommend some of those to you as well. So, first things first, the main horror comics titles that EC came out with back then were The Haunt of Fear, The Vault of Horror, and Tales from the Crypt. And they each had a horror host that was one of these fine-looking people as a horror host, with the Crypt Keeper, the Old Witch, and the Vault Keeper. And they would start the story off hosting it, and they would say, or have like some sort of like funny comedic joke at the beginning, kick you off the story, and then finish it off with some sort of joke about how the bad guy in the story received their just desserts, their comeuppance. So that's your little introduction to EC. So the first volume I'm going to show off are the ones that have, these artists only have 1 volume of these collections of horror comics. So they didn't do very many horror comics. And if you haven't seen these volumes, they're really, really greatly designed by Jacob Covey. They have, like the cover of the book is right there with a nice little emoticon or icon signifying what the book's about. Great title lettering, which EC was known for with their stories. And then the artist involved, and then the Fantagraphics logo on the bottom. So each of these books, most of them, collect just 1 artist's work within it. And you typically it's 1 genre, but they mix it some here and there, especially if the artist didn't do like a whole book's worth of horror comics or what have you. So starting off with Came to Dawn. And these are really great because you can open them up, and on the inside page they'll tell you where all these stories originally were published in. And you can see a lot of these came out in Shock Suspense, but then some of them came out in Haunt of Fear, Tales from the Crypt, and Tales from the Crypt, Haunt of Fear, The Crypt of Terror, The Vault of Horror. So Wallace Wood didn't do a lot of horror comics, but the ones that he did are collected in here. Now, I did a video earlier on my channel this month showing off the new collection of Wallace Wood science fiction book or comics, And that one I highly recommend for anyone wanting to dabble in the science fiction side of EC. Wallace Wood, though, was one of the greatest artists of all time within comics, so you can't go wrong with this, but it still wouldn't be my #1 recommendation for a horror collection if you're trying to get one or two. Here's Joe Orlando, another esteemed and prolific artist in comics, and this also collects some of his crime stories and horror comics. Because the crime and horror, they were at times interchangeable as far as the story goes sometimes, because not all of the horror stories within EC had to do with like zombies and monsters and things. Some of it just had to do with like horrific crimes and people turning into monsters and things, and or not turning into monsters, but like physically, but actually being just like a monstrous human. So they're kind of there's a lot of crossover in there, which makes for these collections to be really great because you can cross over the two. But there's Joe Orlando stuff. Master Race by Bernie Krigstein is the one and only Bernard Krigstein collection we have with the EC Artist Library. And I think this is the only EC work that he did. So this collects all of his EC work, where he did a lot of crime, a lot of horror, and then he did some war comics and some science fiction. So this has all the genres represented. But Bernard Krigstein was one of the all-time great. Well, I'll try not to say all-time great artists for all of these, but the bullpen of EC Comics truly was the greatest bullpen of artists any publisher's ever had. None of their artists were slouches by any means, and they're just some of the best artists and illustrators you'll ever see in comics. Here's Al Feldstein's one and only horror collection, but that's just the ones that he illustrated. Al Feldstein wrote a vast majority of the EC Comics collections throughout the years. This has a lot of crime comics, but also some horror comics towards the end, and the great cover by Feldstein. But Feldstein was a great writer, but also a great artist in here. This is a great collection to own if you're wanting one horror collection. I love the clean line that he has. It's very different than someone that we'll see later, like the Graham Ingels of the world, which is another great thing about these artists, is that they all had kind of a distinct style to them. Like, you can pick them out of the lineup. And Bill Gaines was a fan of having the artists kind of separate themselves and have their own signatures and really prop them up in fandom. They had like letter sections and things like that. If you're familiar with like Marvel Comics and Stan Lee and what he did with the Marvel bullpen, trying to make all the artists and writers kind of characters within the letters columns and things, Stan Lee obviously modeled that after what they did with EC Comics before him. But this is Man and Superman by Harvey Kurtzman. Harvey Kurtzman is one of the all-time most important figures in all of comic book history. If I were to make a list of 10 most important figures in comic book history, Kurtzman would be on that list for sure. But he's mostly known for his humor magazines or his war comics. Both of them were amazing. But this is a small collection, and it collects his earliest EC work, where he was dabbling in horror comics and science fiction. So there's not a lot in here as far as like some of the other collections are thicker than this, but some of the horror comics and stuff that he'd come out with were really creative. Let me see if I can actually get to the stories. And I think it starts off, House of Horror is the first EC story he did, and you get to see his figure drawing in his style. Definitely has a more cartoony tinge to it, which you would see later in his career, and definitely separated himself among all the other artists. That's another great collection. And then the last of the artists that only have one collection in the horror genre, A Slight Case of Murder by George Evans. I think this has crime and horror in it. No, just mostly horror. I do want to shout out Tommy Burns. He is the EC Fan Addict. He has a YouTube channel. You should go check that out. And he also runs the EC Fan Addict page on Facebook, which is one of my favorite Facebook groups to be a part of. But he writes a lot of these introductions in these collections as well. So he's definitely an EC historian. But yeah, George Evans, I prefer his war comics, but still he did great stuff in this genre as well. Grim Fairy Tale, this is a fun story. But they're all like 6 to 8 page strips, so they're like one and done stories with twist endings. Think of like Twilight Zone, where they all have like a premise and twist ending. And like I said earlier, the bad guy within the story gets their just desserts by the end. So it's like, just once one person does something bad and then it doesn't end well for them. All All right, so now we're getting into the volumes of artists that have 2 volumes within the horror genre. And these are by Reed Crandall. He's the artist on both of these. Here is The Bitter End. And this collects some crime stories and then all of his other horror stuff that he did. And Reed Crandall, I think he's one of the more underrated artists within the EC bullpen. Because he could do like really detailed like hatching and things that you would get from like Graham Ingels. But then at times he'd also have kind of a cleaner line that you'd get from like a Johnny Craig. So Reed Crandall, I think, is pretty underrated. Like, just look at that piece right there. But he doesn't get talked about enough. But that's The Bitter End. And High Cost of Dying, which I think is mostly crime and horror. Yeah, this is crime and horror comics. I think that's the... Oh, no. I thought that was the front cover. But again, just like, look at this artwork. Just mind-blowing. And so these are collected in black and white, I should say, as well. And when they were originally published, they were in color. But to date, we haven't had, like, full collections of the original colors of EC Comics. The closest we've gotten so far are the Taschen editions, which I do have a video showing off the first of the Taschen editions. So that's the closest we gotten there. So this is Jack Kamen. So Daddy Lost His Head and Kamen's Calamity. This is the most recent one of these 2. But Jack Kamen was amazing. I've become a fan of his as well. I think he's one of the more underrated artists. But having it in black and white, I should have finished my thought there. You can really see the line work and the ink work of these artists and see how great their artwork was. So I don't think there's anything missing having the colors. Now, Marie Severin, John Severin's sister, did a lot of the color work towards the end of EC Comics. And she was an amazing colorist, one of the best comic book colorists of all time. So I do want the Taschen editions to see those colors of the EC Comics. But these are truly like great just to look at the artwork. And they read well, too. Like, the lettering and everything, like, they read really well in black and white. I can't recommend them enough. Kamen's Calamity is the one that has the one and only volume that has the artist's name in the title. That's because there's actually... I should have said that, too. The titles are all based off of a story within that book. So there actually is a story within this called Kamen's Calamity. And this is collecting all the rest of his horror comics. The Old Witch's Grim Fairy Tale, again. So that's one of the series that Kamen was kind of doing too. Now we're getting on to the 3-volume set. This one is Jack Davis, who is my all-time favorite EC comic book artist. I can gush over Jack Davis's art all day, every day. I absolutely love it, and I love it in every single genre. Now he has a more of a cartoony style. You probably have seen Jack Davis artwork. Even if you're not familiar with Jack Davis, you've probably seen his artwork somewhere and didn't even realize it. He did a lot of artwork for like different sports, like Sports Illustrated and different sports mascots and t-shirts and things that you've probably seen over the years. It's probably his most famous commercial work. But in EC, he dabbled in war comics, the horror comics and crime, and also a lot of work with Mad Magazine. So, but his cartoony style works. He found a way to work it into every single version of the issues that he's working on, whether it be horror comics or comedy with Mad Magazine, and it was just beautiful. So I recommend any one of these, if not all 3 of these, if you're looking for a good horror comic collection to start with. Now, Foul Play is the most recent one. I do have a video showing off this book and just waxing poetic about this one collection that I did last year. I'll link that above or below. And then Taint the Meat is the earliest one, and then Living Mummy came out in between. So any one of these volumes I'd start with. Foul Play probably has the most famous story within it because it was talked about on the Senate floor hearings of the U.S. government. And I talk about that in that video. So if you're looking for one that's like, and it's pretty substantial, it's a thicker collection. If you're wanting one to start with, you can start here. But I just want to flip through here because you can see like the cartoony like character work and figure drawing of Jack Davis, and it just plays so well into this horror comics because like the stories can be as grotesque as possible, but that little bit of tinge of comedy, which I think is present in most great horror stories and movies and everything. Like, you have to have a tinge of comedy, whether it be dark comedy or not, or whether it be the characters kind of like joking around before the terror comes in, something like that. So I think comedy works really well with horror if it's not too overt. But this is the famous story of foul play, where by the end of it, that you can see they're playing with baseball with the head of one old player and his eyes falling out, and the base path is with the entrails of another character. The home plate is with someone's heart. But yeah, these are just like such fun horror comics because they have that tinge of comedy to them in the artwork. The story themselves all maintain this level of seriousness, but the artwork itself gives it kind of this little bit of levity to it. And so Jack Davis is my favorite all-time artist over all of EC. Is he my favorite horror artist of EC Comics? Well, stay tuned for that, because now we're getting into Ghastly Graham Ingels. Now, he doesn't have 3 volumes to his name. He has 4 volumes to his name. Yes, and he was known as Ghastly Graham Ingels because his artwork was ghastly. So this is Doctor of Horror, Grave Business, Accidents and Old Lace, and Sucker Bait. This is the creme de la creme of the horror comics with EC, in my opinion. So if you're wanting if you say like, Taylor, give me one collection to buy of these EC collections, it would be anything with Ghastly Graham Ingels' name on it. So for sci-fi, I'd go Wally Wood. For the horror genre, I'd go with Ghastly Graham Ingels. Crime genre, we'll go with the artist I'm going to talk about in a minute. And then war comics, I'd go with anything with Kurtzman's name on it. And then anything with Jack Davis' name on it will be great as well. But yeah, just his artwork, it had this like overly rendered, overly detailed, just like this, like everything looked like wet and muddy and gross and dirty, like within his artwork. So it was the opposite of the clean line that we see with some of the other artists. Like everything was just like filled in with marks to show like the true nature of just how gross and grotesque these stories can be. And it added so much to the terror and the horror of these stories. So yeah, Ghastly Graham Ingels is my #1 favorite EC horror artist. If you're looking for any of these collections, you can't go wrong with Ghastly Graham Ingels. And then last but not least, I'm going to go with Johnny Craig. Johnny Craig also has 4 titles to his name, collecting horror comics, but also a lot of these collect some of his crime stuff. And that's where, if you're looking for a crime artist to follow, go with Johnny Craig. The Woman Who Loved Life, I often say, is my all-time favorite like crime collection I have in my comic book collection. Like, this is my favorite crime book. And but this also contains some horror stuff in it. And then these are mostly his horror stuff. Now, Johnny Craig was the opposite of Ghastly Graham Ingels. He had a really clean line to his artwork, and that's what you appreciate within these collections. So it's very different than the Ghastly Graham Ingels. And all his like figure drawing of his people within it are just so like great looking. Like all of his characters look so different and distinct. Kind of gives me like Alex Tothian vibe, where Toth was so good at drawing different faces on everybody to make all the characters look distinct. Like Johnny Craig had that ability to him as well. And again, just like the variety you'd get within these comics, because you'd pick up one Hunt of Fear, Vault of Horror, or Tales from the Crypt back in the day, and you would get a Johnny Craig story, and you'd get a Ghastly Graham Ingels story, and just like the variety of artwork you'd get would be amazing. But yeah, Johnny Craig was absolutely brilliant artist. I lean more heavily on his crime stuff than I do his horror stuff, because with the horror stuff, I, again, prefer Ghastly Graham Ingels, but that's not to say I don't love Johnny Craig horror comics at all, because I do absolutely love all these horror comics. But he has 4 collections. Like I said, some of these collect mostly crime, but they do have some horror comics in them. That's Johnny Craig. So just to recap, Johnny Craig is an awesome artist. If you want crime stuff, definitely pick him up. If you want one horror artist to follow, I'm going to go with Ghastly Graham Ingels. My all-time favorite EC artist is Jack Davis, so you cannot go wrong with him, especially if you want a tinge of comedy to your stories. And then Jack Kamen and Crandall are my two most underrated artists of the genre as well. So that's it. That's all I have to say in a short little bit of time about the horror comics of EC and these great EC artist library collections from Fantagraphics. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please give the video a thumbs up. Comment down below who your favorite EC artist is in every genre, or your favorite EC artist in the horror genre, or anything to do with EC Comics. I'll talk to you down in the comments. And subscribe if you haven't already. You don't want to miss out on my 31 days of horror comics at all. So thank you guys so much, and keep talking comics.